my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Zariq is the newest addition to our program in architecture here, and he comes to us with a wealth of experience, having worked in Kuching with the Design Network Architects, in Kuala Lumpur with GDP, and in London with Sketch London Architects. His education is similarly diverse, having got his part 1 at UKM here in Malaysia and his part 2 at Oxford Brookes University in the United Kingdom. Throughout his brief and promising career, he's worked on projects ranging from 23-story mixed-use buildings to historically sensitive renovations of Victorian-era homes in the UK. So we have with us today somebody who is grounded here in Sarawak, has roots right here in Sarawak, but has international experience to share with us. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Zariq Jasni to speak about implementing public squares in urban design. Zariq, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you, Mrs. Zain, for that wonderful introduction. Without further ado, I'd allow me to share screen and begin my presentation on public squares. I'll begin with introducing public square in urban design. So what are the principles of a public square and how it affects user experience in design? So as an introduction, public squares have been part and parcel of a city's townscape. So what I seek to explore is the idea of how squares can affect the user experience when a particular user is wandering around in a city. So to start with the presentation, I'd like to introduce what is a public square. So a public square, in its literal meaning, is a square or a plaza that could be a link from one node to another, or a destination where members of the society utilize the space to meet and socialize. And in urban terms, a square is a piece of landmark that defines the city. So streets and squares are the primary, and many would argue the most important open space in the dense urban core of cities all throughout the world. So moving on to my next slide, as you can see here, a square or a plaza could be a node or a landmark depending on the location that it is situated. So take, for example, the Trafalgar Square in London, where the scale of it is, it's immensely massive, but due to its association to being a tourist destination in London, the frequency of pedestrian footfall is not an issue. And then the next example of a successful public square is the Piazza Vecchia in Italy. As you can see here, the context surrounding the square is historical. It is rather vernacular, traditional to Italian architecture, but you could see how the modern integration of a public square uplifts and attracts users to actually use the space. And this is another example of a square in Spain where it utilizes the design feature of an umbrella and then multiplied into a sequence of umbrellas with different colors, and it serves as an attraction point for the tourists when they come and visit Spain, for example. So as you can see, rather than just having an empty, barren space, some architects have utilized this space and used it as a point of attraction. So now we're going to talk about the elements and principles of a great public square. So principle number 1 is the context, the scale, the size, and the shape. So according to Gatje, the average dimensions of Europe's Great Old Squares vary between 56 meters by 142 meters to 80 meters to 125 meters. So these figures are important because this could be applied to the design of a square, as these are the maximum distance applicable in order to see and engage in events that are happening inside the square. And then we have another great urban designer who came up with the dimensions of a square. So as you can see in this example here, these are typologies of squares around the world, but primarily the sizes would range between 60 meters wide and 150 meters long. So in terms of urban design, it's a measurement where we could see whatever's happening inside the square. So it's in between the sweet spot of wide and narrow. Squares could come with different programs. Among the programs that have been seen, that we could see like all throughout the world, we have urban farms, we have picnic areas, we have amphitheaters, and as you can see in this diagram, there's probably 16 possible options for a program that could exist in a square. And then according to Yangel, a dimension as stated below can be applied to the design of a square, as these are the maximum distance applicable to see and engage in events that are happening inside the square. So Yangel proposed that the ideal size of a public square is 70 meters times 100 meters. The next point would be context. So in the process of designing a city, one should not practice the act of copycat architecture, as it may lead to downfall of the original character of the city, identity conflict, and kitsch architecture. So when designing a square, it is important to take into account the surrounding element, the cultural and the heritage values of a city. To explain a little bit more on kitsch architecture, so essentially it is defined as having certain elements in a building that are classically associated with traditional architecture, but have no relation to the styles and trends in the region it has been built in. So the picture that I have included in this slide shows the Macedonia Square in Skopje, North Macedonia. So this is an interesting city because traditionally and in terms of heritage, it is more Balkan, it is more Yugoslavic. It was part of Yugoslavia, so it is more ranging towards the more communist region. So if you could see the architecture that makes up Macedonia, it has been, redefined by the previous government in 2014. So what they did was they added up European elements that are not traditionally what makes up the architecture of Macedonia. So this leads to the less successful appearance of the square. It is aesthetically beautiful, but in terms of the functionality of the square, it is not as successful as other squares that I will show later on in this presentation. So next would be scale. So a great square is composed of a proportionate scale that delivers a pleasant sense of enclosure for its users. So the design of the forum should be proportionate to the number of its inhabitants, so that it is not too small of a space to be useful, nor look like desert waste for lack of population. And the ratio of 1 to 2 for the height of a building to the size of the square shall be imposed so that users can appreciate the architecture design of a building and see how they contribute to the overall city townscape. As you can see, there are minimum distance required in the design of a square. We could delve deeper into each and every measurements to make sure that the square that we're designing is appropriate. But I think the ratio of 1 to 2 for the height of a building to the size of the square shall be imposed because it allows some breathing space between the building and the square itself, and for natural surveillance to happen. So principle number 2 is active edges. I know some of these terms are more urban rather than architectural, but I think it is vital because I want to share these keywords in urban design that year 2 students could use because they are designing a town square for their final project 3. Yeah, so what makes a public square successful? So the types of edges is a vital urban design quality that becomes a factor for people to stay in the square. When we design a public square, the number one thing is that we want people to actually use the square. So a connected square with active edges will draw people out of establishments or buildings into the square. And small businesses such as independent coffee shops could benefit from the space between the foreground of a building to be a walkway by providing seating spaces for their customers. So easily available commodities influence people to become more likely to stay in space. This is an example of a successful square in Wrocław in Poland. So as you can see on the street level over there, active edges promote higher footfall at the public square. See it in the perspective of of a person using the space. Say for example, we're visiting the square and these shops on the ground floor, the restaurants, the cafes, it allows us to integrate with the local community who actually lives and works in and around the square. So it allows this livelihood to exist and it attracts people to actually use the square even more. So principle number 3 is building use. What makes a public square successful is the diversity of uses in the buildings surrounding the square. So it is important that we emphasize on mixing and alternating the building types surrounding the square, as this sustains the amount of human activity in and around the site. A square surrounded by retail stores and cafes on the ground floor and residential apartments on the upper floor would exhibit a higher degree of livelihood compared to a square that is surrounded by tall office buildings that are empty during the night. This is an example of a public square in London. So this has got a slightly different typology because it is a sunken public square, but they have integrated. I like what the architect has done here. As you can see, the buildings in the foreground, just behind whatever is happening down there on the lower ground floor, those are office spaces. So these office spaces would usually be dormant or empty during the night. So one strategy that the architects have adopted to keep the livelihood is by integrating commercial stores on the lower ground floor. What they did is they studied the human interaction, how office workers could use the space. So primarily, this space is used as a place where people could go for their lunch, and it is mostly active, during the day, but less active during the night. But it shows how we as architects, one important point when designing these public squares is to study the human that use the space around it. So I think the architects have done quite a successful gesture in reinventing this public square. So now we will look into the function of a public square. So we're looking into case studies of squares in Wroclaw, Barcelona, and Paris. No, sorry, actually Wroclaw, Seville, and Paris. So the first square that I mentioned before was used as a vessel to execute trading activities, as we have seen throughout history. So this square has existed ever since the early days when Poland was what it was in several during the years before, even before World War II. So I believe this square has survived multiple eras, and many European squares have served the purpose of as a marketplace due to the width of the square being large enough for traders from other parts of the city to sell their goods. So it is, as you can see, this is an example of a square being used in the sector of economics. The second one is Plaza de España in Seville. So this is a more cultural square where it was designed by a great Seville architect called Anibal Gonzalez as an emblematic space for the 1929 Ibero-American Expo. So this plaza serves as a cultural space where the heritage values of Seville takes center stage in attracting tourists from all over the globe. And it also integrates the essence of recreation. As you can see in the middle of the plaza, there's like a tiny artificial river that flows from one end to another. So people actually use that space, well, mainly for tourism activities, but sometimes it could also be used as a matter of recreational. People could go jogging in and around the plaza because it's big enough to sustain such activities. And this is an exciting square that exists in Paris. So obviously this does not exist now, but it is being used for the 2024 Olympics that is going to be held in Paris. So as you can see, Place de la Concorde, the largest public square in Paris, it is located near the Tuileries Garden, and it will become the host to an urban park that will be the site of breaking, BMX freestyle, skateboarding, and 3x3 basketball. This visionary gesture showcases how versatile a public square can be, where in this case it is utilized as a venue for the Olympics. So these slides have shown that a public square can be versatile. It could be used as an event space for cultural activities or even economics. And those are just 3 points out of multiple typologies that could be added into a public square. So in terms of user experience, public squares promote better physical health for people who use it. So open spaces promote walking by increasing accessibility and connectivity. So interventions such as street furniture in the design of a public square encourages more users to use the space. So by promoting walkability in public open spaces, carbon emission can be reduced through the decreased number of vehicles entering the city. And in terms of social well-being, squares function as a venue for gatherings and social engagement. So the square should be able to accommodate a number of people based on the density of the dwellers in the area. So in terms of social well-being, when designing a public square, it is important that we respond to to the people that lives in and around the area, because it wouldn't make sense to design such a big public square if the dwellers are not as high. So it is important for us architects to respond to the density of the people that lives in such an area. And the square should take into account inclusivity in design with considered elements to cater for people with disabilities. So you would want people from all walks of life to use the square, right? So in terms of ramps integrated into the landscaping, those are design elements that would enrich the experience for all people to use your square. And last but not least is the visual surveillance would allow pedestrians to feel safe when walking along the streets of a city. So increased pedestrian footfall contributes to level of safety and facilitates a communal spirit among users. So based on those points that I've made just now, I'd like to introduce you to my final year thesis project, which was called the Carnival of Democratic Occasions. So during my final year at Oxford Brookes University, I integrated what I've learned in my fourth year, which is designing a public square, and I implemented it into the grounds of a university in Macedonia. So as you can see in this image over here, what I designed is a debate platform between the left wing and the right wing of people who support the government's decision. So we can go, I can tell you more about what happened in Macedonia that caused the emergence of left wing and right wing, people who support versus people who detest the government. But then the essence here that I'd like to highlight is a public square could take form of a debate platform. So the next drawing shows you how I've integrated multiple programs in a public square. So as you can see, the brutalist buildings that surround this public compound, those are the existing building for the National University of Skopje in Macedonia. And how I integrated people to actually use the square is by designing and promoting different debate platforms that serve different purposes. So the main reason for this debate was because I wanted people to use, because as you can see, without the intervention, the debate platform that I've designed on the right allows the students to use the space not only for social activities, but also for brainstorming on the issue of national identity of Macedonia. So these were the outcomes. I included this image in my presentation because I feel like it would help the year two students to brainstorm for the project 3. Their task is to design a town square that includes installation. So I think if students are able to produce these kind of models, so I think for the year 2 students, you could be able to integrate lighting elements, playful elements such as if you look at the image on the left hand side, I included parts of the models that could move and human figures that interact with the actual installation that I was proposing in the grounds of the university. So in this plan, it shows that how multiple interventions at each faculty of the university could add up to a carnivalesque assembly of the space. So in terms of building these structures, I'd like to encourage the students to come up with these kind of drawings. So it shows how, for example, one installation could have the ability to showcase a series of floor plans and sectional view for us to understand more of how this space would work. And I think for the year 2 students, coming up with a components catalog of each part of the structure that you guys are building would help very much in understanding how to construct your installation or structures. So that's it from me, and I would invite anyone who has any questions about the presentation.
We've got 55 students in attendance here, which is wonderful to see. I'm sure somebody out there has a question or two they'd like to send in your direction, Zariq.
Yep.
Students, you can, okay, so there's a comment there from Audrey. Is a small park also considered as a public square?
So as looking at, so that's a good question, thank you. So a small park, it depends on the not the appearance, but more about the context surrounding the park. Is the park a standalone park, or is it culturally something that has existed along the years? I'll take an example of Super Killen in Copenhagen. So it used to be something that's a bit barren. I wouldn't say it's more like a small park, but it's sorry, let me just look at this. So in terms of the park, can you be a bit more specific on the park? I think it depends. No, so a standard park. So it depends on the locality of the park itself. Look at the buildings that surround it. So to compare a park that has no connections to the building, that would cause there would be less people visiting the park, and usually squares would have a combination of two functions. So for example, it could be an event space, and then it could also be in terms of recreational. Just looking at the typologies, they are different, but I think there's an opportunity to merge them to become a public square. So
Okay.
it is, yeah.
All right, I think that answers that quite well. Thank you. Dr. Atta is also asking about our local padang. Some scholars acknowledge the padang we have is our version of public squares. So do you think we ought to design better padangs rather than emulating squares based on European ideals?
Thank you, Dr. Atta, for that question. I think, yes, Padang is a version of a public square, and I think definitely looking at the local context of Kuching, for example, Padang Merdeka could be deemed as a public square. because we looking at the typology, looking at the science, looking at the context around it. I think this designing better Padang by referencing the culture and the locality of the space. This could be a rather successful idea to be executed, but I think again, looking at terms such as halaman or such as terms such as halaman, sorry, I think the integration of shading is important. So as we can see, again, using the reference data, we have a vast landscape, but we can see local trees that in the area. I think there are opportunities to actually use the pattern into more multifunctional spaces. So this pattern would be successful in our local context.
Zariq, you used the word successful just now, and I think that's a good segue.
That I'm seeing on the chat section.
Oh, sorry. So, Zariq, you used the word successful just now in your answer to Dr. Atta, and that's a good segue into the next question from a student that was sent to me, which is, can we know how to consider the space as a successful urban space or not? Are there any standards for us to judge whether a public space is in fact successful?
Any standard? Okay, thank you for the question. Sorry, can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, so we can hear you. There might be a bit of a lag,
Hello,
but you can
you
go
hear
ahead
me?
and speak.
Testing. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. The internet here is a bit laggy. I couldn't hear Mr. Zain properly. So to answer the question, can we know how to consider this space as a successful urban space or not? Is there any standard for it? I believe there is a standard derived by Yangel in 1968. That's how
Oh, it looks like we've lost Zariq entirely. A bit of a connection issue throughout this session, unfortunately. We'll see if he's able to rejoin us. Please stand by. The idea of a successful urban space, I'll just add my own 2 cents here while we're waiting for our speaker to return. Coming from, I just returned from 4 weeks in the United States, where I was in the city of Burlington, that has a public space that is considered one of the best pedestrian streets in the United States. And I think that there's a very short answer to that from my point of view, which is that it's successful if there are people there, right? If it is full of users, it is full of citizens, then I think that's at least one very important measure of a successful space. Zariq, I was just filling in while we were waiting for you. Back to you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Bad internet. Anyways, yeah. So to answer the question just now, I think the ability to sustain a high degree of footfall at a public space is one measure to um, is one way to measure the success of a public space, and also in terms of the ability of the space itself to sustain an event, given its vast measurements. I think the livelihood, the sense of safety that the space is providing through, the correct dimensions, and also how it interacts with the buildings surrounding the public square. Those are the qualities that you look um, in measuring whether this space is successful. But I think most importantly, one way to measure it is the amount of engagement that you get from the community. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that. I think we have time for a few more questions. Anything else from the audience? Maybe I'll just throw in one question of my own. It complicates the question of engagement, and that is the issue of undesirables, right? What do we do, or how should we think about use of the space by people that we do not approve of in some way, right? The undesirable user.
The undesirable user. Thank you for that question, Mr. Zain. I think when you mentioned undesirable users, the first thing that came to mind is people without homes, homeless people. It's a good question because um, we could see in certain squares people, say for example, like Leicester Square that I've been to in London. Um, I could see homeless people taking shelter in this space, and I feel that architecture should be welcoming. It is a public space, and I don't think it's right to differentiate, people who have homes to use the space and homeless people to use the space. I just think that with proper design and enforcement, it could educate people from all walks of life to um, use the square according to its function, but also um, it should be welcoming to peoples of all walks of life, I think. So, again, when we talk about inclusivity, do we allow the homeless people to stay in the square? Will it deter other users from using it? I think that would be um, something that the architects and the local council could, you know, engage with in a deeper manner. I think there has to be a reason why homeless people feel like they belong or feel like they could use this space as a shelter. So I think by perhaps providing proper shelter that maybe not exactly within the parameters of the public square, but close by, I think it could serve as a solution to, you know, um, allow the public space to function as how we intend it to be, while not exactly telling, oh, just some people from the community could use it, the homeless could not use it. I think yeah, in essence it has to be inclusive. That would be my answer.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Are there any last questions from Zariq here today? All right. Well, I think we've reached the end of our slot here for this morning. So I would like to thank you very much, Zariq, for sharing your experiences and the results of your studies previously, and look forward to hearing more about this subject from you in the future.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Zariq.
On behalf of the program, I would like to once again record our thanks and to call this session to a close. So with that, I'll see you all next time.